Welcome, everybody who's watching this. This is our weekly feature, World Schooling Education Live. And today I have a very special guest. I'm speaking with Blake Boles. And first of all, welcome, Blake.
Thank you, Lainey. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very, very welcome. So we're going to jump in and talk about your new project, but before we do that, give our audience just a brief introduction to who you are and the things that you've done. You're one of the leaders in our alternative education movement, and it's such a great honor to have you here in our group speaking about something that's so relevant to our audience. So.
Sure. I grew up in California public schools. I discovered alternative education when I was in college, and I ended up designing my own major in alternative schooling. And a few years after that, I got involved with the Not Back to School Camp community. And that was a really inspiring thing for me. I got to meet 100 real-life teenage unschoolers, and I said, these are pretty awesome people. I'd like to work with them. And I had a big travel bug myself. I had quit my jobs and run away to South America for 3 months when I was 24. And I really loved Argentina and I wanted to go back. And so I ended up creating my company, Unschool Adventures, in 2008, and took a group of 9 teenager homeschoolers and unschoolers to Argentina for 6 weeks. And it was incredible, and I had a business all of a sudden, and so that's what I've been doing more or less for the past decade. And along the way, wrote some books based upon the teenagers who I've met and worked with, and also research. And those have been about how you go to college if you don't go to high school, what you can do instead of going to four-year college, what self-directed learning looks like, because that's a really weird, nebulous phrase. And then this latest book, which comes out tomorrow, which is called Why Are You Still Sending Your Kids to School?
So, first of all, there's so much to talk about in your introduction, and we've got such an alignment in terms of travel as education and working with teens in the spirit, but I really want to focus today on your book. So the book that you wrote that's coming out, Why Are You Still Sending Your Kids to School? This is a big question, and before we get into why, can you talk about whether or not this is a companion to the Teenage Liberation Handbook, which I know is a huge part of your influence as well?
The Teenage Liberation Handbook was massive for me when I read it at age 21. And at this moment, I'm actually helping Grace Llewellyn edit the 3rd and final edition of the Teenage Liberation Handbook. A great honor for me to get to work with her. I would say this is definitely different than the Teenage Liberation Handbook. It would go along very well with that book. My book is for parents. Grace's book is for teens. And I was really inspired by Grace's book, so much so that I wrote my first 2 books for young people as the audience, for teenagers and college-aged young adults, respectively. But this book is definitely for parents. I've realized that parents are my audience, and mostly it's moms who are my audience. And they're the ones who find the books, and then they hand them to their teenagers or their kids of other ages. And so I've come to accept that fact and wrote this book with parents as the primary audience.
And I just wanted to make sure that's something that you said, because both books have their place, and the Teenage Liberation Handbook was such an inspiration to me, but I read it as a mom too. And your book, which I'm almost finished reading, which is so good, it's so well cited and researched that,
Thank you.
yes, this really is kind of like the companion in my perspective. So I'm blown away at the work that you put into this book. So let's get down to it. What prompted you to write this book?
It's a good question. I've been doing some research over the past 5 years that felt like it really needed to be expressed in book format. I had published some articles about going deeper into the question of higher education and if it's worth it or not. I had done a lot of research into parenting, even though I'm not a parent yet myself. And I'd been thinking a lot about Peter Gray's theory of unlimited play, as kind of a vehicle for education. And I wanted to sort of dig deeper into that and elaborate on it. And I also wanted to update some of the things I'd said about how homeschoolers and unschoolers and other alternatively educated kids get into college, how they do in college. And really, I wanted to bring in a lot of the research because when I came into this world, everything was pretty much anecdotal. And now in 2020, there's actually a decent amount of research which you can look at and say, okay, this is real data, this is real science and not just stories. And so I wanted to bring all of that into one place. And that's especially for parents who are more on the skeptical end of the spectrum. For parents who see that school is not working for their kids and they're thinking we should probably do something else, but then they think homeschooling, that's crazy. These radical alternative schools where there's no curriculum, that's crazy. And so I wanted to bring in some hard research that says this is not crazy and you're not going to screw your kid up by taking one of these very alternative paths.
So I'm glad that you answered this question first before we get into the content of the book. But I would, and this is something that I said to you before we actually went live, I'm going to ask you to consider answering these questions to a very international audience. And even though the research in the book and the book primarily is written for American moms, in my that's how
Yeah, parents.
as American
Yeah.
mom, you know,
Yeah.
try to think of it as a broader perspective because we do have quite an international community here. Mm-hmm. And in terms of using this information to help them, I feel like it's important to not only say this up front, but to have you be aware that, you know, if you shift your perspective and you're answering and speaking to an international audience of moms.
Yes.
And
I will do my best to keep that in mind and add disclaimers when something I say is North America centric.
Okay, fantastic. So that being said, just sort of as an overview, how do you think world schoolers who are already in the mindset that they want to take a different perspective, a different approach to not only their lives as a family, and we'll get into that as we get into some of the deeper content of your book, but they've already stepped into potentially an alternative path. How can world schoolers adapt this information for them if they're not US based or they come from the US?
Well, I'd say if you've already chosen to world school, you are probably pretty far down the line of understanding and, you know, grasping the big ideas. And so I might even say that if you're already world schooling, this book is not primarily written for you. This might be more, this book might be more appropriately addressed towards your friends who you have, who are thinking, I would love to do what you're doing, but I'm afraid. And I'm afraid because I think I'm going to screw my kid's life up. I'm afraid because I think they're going to fall behind. All of the pretty typical reasons. And so this book might actually be a better fit for those proto world schoolers and proto homeschoolers, unschoolers, alternative schoolers. That being said, I think that you can still have a lot of concerns and doubts and anxieties. And when, let's say you're world schooling and your kids are between ages 5 and 10, and you're traveling around, they're learning stuff, you know, through travel and maybe, you know, some self-directed learning through the computer or books. That might feel fairly secure, but then when you're moving into the adolescent realm, it might feel like, oh, wait a second, if my kid needs to go to college or chooses to go to college, you know, are we really screwing them up by not sending them back, by, you know, stopping world schooling and just settling down and going to a regular high school? I think that there is a lot of concern like that among both homeschoolers and world schoolers. And as you mentioned, the book is written with a North America centric perspective because that's where most of my readers come from. And also because that is, you know, North America, the US and Canada is genuinely like the best place in the world to have a very flexible legal framework for doing your homeschooling, your self-directed learning. And of course, you know, researching the specific frameworks of many different countries was outside of the scope of this book, but I am familiar generally with how easy or difficult it is to do this kind of thing in Europe, in Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, in the UK, and in Central and South America. And in general, it only gets harder in these other countries. And so I think one message I would like to put out there for world schooling families at this moment in this book is that if you are thinking about relocating and therefore falling under the legal jurisdiction of a country outside of the US or Canada, maybe it's time to shift your perspective from thinking that homeschooling is the best framework for your kid and into considering alternative schools, considering distance enrollment programs, because really you might just be setting yourself up for a really horrific battle, which you're not going to win if you decide you want to become a legal homeschooler in Spain, for example. If you decide you want to try to become a homeschooler in Thailand, it's like, geez, maybe you could just find like a small alternative school there that has unschooling or world schooling type values. Maybe you can find an online program like the Clonlara School that will let your kid continue to, work towards an accredited high school diploma if that feels like an important thing. And functionally, you're still world schooling or you're still unschooling.
So of course you're jumping ahead. So since you brought up all of these alternative possibilities, by all means, why don't we go a little bit deeper and explore what some of these possibilities are. And before you do that, I do want to say that our audience, our community is in different stages of their world schooling journey. So some are just starting out. And I would say that this book is such an incredible a documentation of research that for anybody who's a skeptic in your family, this is the book to give them. If you are deschooling yourself, this is even if you're from another country, the research is so thorough in this book, and I think you did such an incredible job. Okay, so that's my compliment, but now let's get into those world schooling or alternative educational options.
Sure. So I discuss the traditional progressive schools like Montessori and Waldorf. And I think for a lot of younger kids, those can be great options. But as you get into the older range, middle school, high school range, those schools often tend to look a lot like ritzy private schools and charge the same kind of tuition. And they become less alternative. They become much more like conventional schools. Peter Gray wrote a wonderful article about comparing progressive schools to self-directed education. That's worth finding. I talk about some public charter school or virtual school options. There are some nice hybrid programs out there where you can, this is definitely for the US, where you can sign your kid up but retain a lot of autonomy and a lot of flexibility. The public school district might even give you cash to do your homeschooling type things. And crucially, your kid can have access to some of the public school resources like certain classes or activities. And so that can be a good fit for some families, especially families who are just transitioning out of like, we have to do conventional school. It can be a good gateway into the more self-directed paths. I spend a lot of time talking about the radical alternative schools. And for me, these include Sudbury schools, which are representative of democratic free schools in general. There are liberated learner centers. That's a rapidly expanding movement on the East Coast of the United States and, well, not really international at this moment. And then agile learning centers. And those are expanding in the US, but also in Mexico and also in some parts of Europe. And so that is a good network. If you haven't heard of agile learning centers, go Google them because you might find a community that is really aligned with your values. And yeah, it's a very flexible model. It's a very open sourced type model, whereas Sudbury might be more of a closed model. They're much more specific. So I talk about those schools and centers and how they are, more or less as good as you're going to get if you want to have unschooling, but within, a physical space where there's other kids and where it serves the child supervision function of a more traditional school. And then finally, talk about homeschooling and unschooling. And I really just spend most of my time dissuading people of the homeschooling stereotypes and myths and sharing the most recent statistical data, which essentially says, listen, you might have this idea that homeschoolers are mostly conservative, religious, and sheltering, but that's not that true anymore. That might have been true 20 years ago, but it's an increasingly diverse group of people, socioeconomically diverse, racially diverse, and it's something that a lot of different groups are embracing right now. And while you can do it in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Norway, some other countries make it actually easy to homeschool. Still, the US and Canada, it's the best place to be. And that's fine, because if you can get your kid signed up as a homeschooler in the US and you travel the world for a lot of the year, it can work out well for a lot of families. And then I talk about unschooling, and unschooling is the most familiar territory for me, but I try to make a point of saying, listen, if you discover that you love unschooling, that's great. But consider adding the words "for now" at the end of that sentence. I think unschooling is perfect for my kid for now, because your kid is going to be a different person next year and 5 years from now. And I think that any sort of dogmatic adherence to any single educational solution for a kid is going to prove to be problematic or dangerous in the long run. And so most of the teenagers who I have worked with have ended up flowing in between different styles of alternative education. So they might conventionally homeschool for a while, they might unschool for a while. The need to have peers and social interactions might bring a kid to an alternative school or even back into conventional public school for a bit. I don't know too many who happily go back to conventional public school, but I know many who have tried it out. And I think that's a great thing to encourage your kid to do, just so you're not thinking of the bogeyman of school. Let them actually see what the alternative is.
So since we're talking to parents of teens, this is our primary focus and how teens can educate themselves either through alternative systems or self-education. If the parents, and granted, in North America, you're going to answer this question from a North America perspective, but if parents are willing now, after reading your fabulous book, to try this, what's required from the families to get their kids out of the school system, to quit school?
I mean, that's really the easiest part, Lainey. As you know, a lot of people think that that's going to be the challenge. Like, how do I get them out of the school system? And it's not hard. You either enroll them in something else which fulfills the compulsory education requirement, so some sort of alternative school, or some sort of, for example, public charter type program, or you declare them to be homeschoolers, and that's a state by state law or a province by province law in Canada. And it's shockingly easy to do that. It is, it's free, it's easy. In California, where I'm from, you sign a single piece of paper digitally, and your kid is now enrolled in your home private school. Ta-da, you don't have to do anything else except keep enrollment records. And in the most restrictive states in the US, which I think are fairly representative of what regulations like are in Canada, like in New York State, for example, it's easy to sign up to be a homeschooler. Every few years, your kid will have to take a standardized exam and score above the 33rd percentile to prove that they are keeping up with other kids their age, at least to a certain degree. Most families I know who have to face these tests and show state officials that they are making progress say that it's really easy hoop jumping, both for the parents and for the kids. Pretty minimal investment of time.
So we know, though, as an American, we know that there are high regulation states and low regulation states. And so there's no blanket answer for the United States or for the different provinces.
That's right.
In terms of the steps that you have to do. So in terms of, okay, that's the first step. What about the mindset that's required from a parent?
Ooh, that is a great question. Well, I think a lot of parents go into alternative education wanting to hold the same standards and goals for their kids that they did when their kid was in the conventional education system. And And that is a fairly, that has the potential to be a fairly toxic and destructive thing, because then we're just trying to recreate school at home, or we're trying to badger the people who are working at the alternative school, for example, to be like, hey, make sure my kid is learning algebra. And those poor staff are like, I'm not able to do that. Like, this is the wrong place for that. And so I think for parents, the first thing that has to happen, as you mentioned before, is the deschooling process and the shedding of assumptions. And this can be a very difficult thing to do, especially for parents who are highly educated, highly credentialed people themselves. You know, they look at this 13-year-old who seems to be doing nothing of value, nothing that seems productive. And they say, wait a sec, this is not what I signed up for. Actually, it is what you signed up for. It's just, we need the eyes to see it, and we need the terminology to understand what's going on here when these kids appear to be doing nothing, or they're just hanging out, socializing, exploring YouTube. And so in the book, I have a whole chapter about work and play, and I make some arguments about how when it appears that young people are doing nothing productive, it's often the case that they are engaging with something where they feel a sense of control, where they feel challenged in a meaningful way. And I can talk more about that if you'd like, Lainey, but it requires seeing with new eyes what productivity is, what a waste of time is. And your kid, especially if they're coming straight from conventional school or from conventional homeschooling, they need to do a hard reset on their motivational system. And that might take months, it might even take years of them appearing to do nothing.
So you talk a little bit about the role of technology in your book as well. Can you expand on that?
Well, I don't know how much I talk about technology per se. I definitely talk about gaming and video gaming and computer gaming. And I try to actually, yeah, I try to stay out of the screen time wars in this book. There's other books you can read about screen time. But on the subject of games, I think those are really important to discuss because, first of all, for many kids, that is the primary screen time thing that they do. And also, games are just very triggering for parents. And today, the games that we might be talking about are The Sims, Fortnite, Minecraft. I might even be a bit out of date at this point by listing those. But these games, World of Warcraft is another good example. These games are the things that kids, whether they're in school or they're out of school, will naturally gravitate towards once they have an iota of free time. And I think that this is a really important thing to understand. And so to go back to what I was saying, these kids go into worlds like Minecraft because it's where they are in charge. It's where they are respected. It's where the work that they do is seen for the results and not, they're not labeled just because they're a certain age or because they're in a certain class. Really, it's a world where they can be full humans. And so that's the reason that they will flock towards these games immediately. And even kids in school, on weekends, holidays, late nights, they will flock towards these games. And so we need to recognize that kids need to feel a certain level of autonomy. They need to feel that they can contribute to something. And that's what you're doing in Minecraft or in World of Warcraft. You are contributing to something. The best games are often team-based games. And it's a very complex activity to do well in these games. And what we need to pay attention to is, what is the reward for beating these games? The reward for beating a quest, for completing a quest in World of Warcraft, is not that the game ends. It's that you get another harder quest. And that is a really good thing. We have to be able to see this and say, okay, this is the kind of thing we want kids, especially adolescents, to be doing, voluntarily taking on challenges. And when they're done with that challenge, they are seeking the next challenge. And so this is why I say games have something to teach us. This doesn't mean that I'm saying if your kid just games for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, that they're going to be completely fine. The author who I talk about the most in my gaming section is Jane McGonigal. Her research says, listen, 20 hours a week of gaming is probably, fine to get all the benefits. Once your kid gets up to 40 hours a week, then things might start going downhill. I don't know. I've met kids who game 40 hours a week and they seem to be totally fine. And so it really could be a case by case basis thing. Um, but in my own work, Lainey, I've worked mostly with kids in wilderness environments and travel environments. And those are the things that I personally get most excited about. And these are still game-like environments. These are environments where kids have to learn the rules. They have to work with other people to make things happen. And most importantly, just like a game, it's voluntarily chosen. That's why when I run Unschool Adventures trips, I don't accept anyone whose parents just signed them up for the program. They have to do a Skype interview and prove to me that they want to be on this program for their own reasons. Because I don't want some kid in a foreign country who doesn't want to be on my program fundamentally, who doesn't know what they're getting themselves into. Just like a school teacher doesn't want kids who don't want to be in school in their classroom. Those are the kids who just make things difficult for everyone else who might actually want to be there.
Yeah, we're the same way. So when I was reading the gaming chapter, it occurred to me that as a world schooler, the gamification that you were talking about in terms of challenges and going on to the next level and making achievements is something that, and as you bring up, can be transferred to just general life skills. But as a world schooler, that's huge when it comes to unlocking, a language or understanding culture. So I know this is not in your book, but from your perspective as a traveler and as somebody who runs, trips for teens, can you talk about a little deeper about how the world schooling and the gamification actually go hand in hand?
Yeah, I'd love to. So what's great about international travel is that it just demands self-directed learning by its very nature. If you are walking around some market and you don't speak the language, or you're very, weak on the language, just having to interact with someone, to make a purchase, to ask where a bathroom is, that is almost like a game itself. And it's a game with very real boundaries and consequences and feedback. The feedback is the crucial part here. That's what happens when you attempt to use a foreign language and you're not that proficient. You get direct feedback about whether you are meeting your goal or not. And this is why I think that world schooling makes so much sense, because you don't have to do much in terms of thinking about how I'm going to educate my kids. You just do what you're doing anyways when you're traveling, and you bring kids along. It makes so much sense. And so I think the gamification argument works really well with world schooling and with a life of fairly constant travel. And the tricky part is just making sure that your kid has appropriate challenge levels. And so, yeah, when your kid is 8, maybe trying to buy something in the market is the appropriate challenge. That's the hard level that they're going to beat, so to speak. But the same, a 13-year-old trying to do the same thing might just be bored. And if you say, hey, go to the market and buy some tomatoes, and they're like, yeah, I know how to do that. It's like, all right, time to come up with the next challenge. What's the next level here? And so, that's something that I have thought a lot about when running teen trips, because with an appropriate challenge, that's how you get engagement. And I think that's the ultimate goal, regardless of your educational environment, is to have a kid who's highly engaged, who is not bored very often, and who feels positive stress, which is the stress that comes from doing something exciting, like trying to use a foreign language, and not overwhelmed by toxic stress, which I think comes from more conventional school systems usually.
Right. And then that goes back to what you were writing about with the play as a huge element of learning. Do you feel that teens in general have a difficult time accessing their play as they're on the precipice of adulthood and they're behind them is childhood? Do you feel that I don't know, is this an innate sense that is hard to access as a teen? I mean, I definitely have my opinions about it working with teens, but in terms of the research that you've done and the work that you've done, What are your findings?
Well, I think we just need to define our terms a bit better, because when we talk about play as a way to learn or play as the work of a child, I think that's extremely clear for younger children. And then at some point, though, these children become adults. And and we can see that this concept of play needs to evolve somehow, because a kid is not going to retain they're not going to act and they're not going to play in the same way that we conceive of a 5-year-old playing when they're 25 years old. Like humans go through stages of development, and it's this idea that a kid is always going to retain their very youthful play-like spirit, I think is a fairly flawed concept. I think that we want to make sure people stay active and curious and engaged, but that's going to look different for people in different stages of life. And so I don't actually think about prioritizing play for teenagers. I think that playfulness and having a sense of humor are important things. But I mean, historically, Lainey, and this is something that I bring up in this chapter about work versus play, adolescents, so let's say people ages 13 to 18, they worked when they were in a part of human societies for like all of human history up until about 100 years ago, when we created these systems of middle school and high school. And so I think that it's a very likely thing that there's this intrinsic need for a lot of adolescents to contribute to something, to the human society somehow. And for the most part, we have made it very difficult for them to do that. And by contribute, I mean work. And so it used to be that kids were working on farms. It used to be that there was child labor and, you know, very horrible conditions. And so it's a good thing that we don't have horrible child labor anymore. And farm work has largely disappeared from developed nations. And so what is the work that we have left for kids? And so I think there's actually, adolescents. I think that there's a very fine line between work and play. And that's the challenge of engaging a teenager. And I think this ties right back into this notion of gaming and gamification. The things that kids love to do most in middle school and high school, I think, are often the extracurriculars. So band, drama, sports, mock trial, robotics clubs, journalism, that kind of stuff. That is stuff that gives kids a sense of purpose. It gives them something to contribute to. And we need to take our cues from those sorts of activities. Also travel, also wilderness trips, and also video games. And that is the stuff that should and constitute the bulk of an adolescent's education, in my opinion. And then jumping through hoops to try to get into college or prepare for career, that can be the side project that you do as needed. Otherwise, stick with the highly engaging stuff. And that, I think, will fulfill the sense of both work and play for a teenager.
You know, as somebody who didn't want to see my questions beforehand, each answer leads perfectly into the next question.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So my next question really is, can you talk about the relationship between interest and purpose?
Another good question. So,
this all comes from your book. So,
oh no, I should be able to speak about this. What have I done? Yeah, well, I'm going to answer this question maybe in a slightly different way. I hope I'm still hitting the nail on the head for you. I think that there's a really easy way to conceive of interest and purpose, and that's, you know, passion. You want to find something that you're so interested in that you will, passionately pursue it. And we ask kids, what are you passionate about? What do you want to do when you grow up? And that can be a very helpful discussion. I think that there's another argument to be made. I just touch on this briefly in the final chapter of the book. For doing something with your time, either as a teenager or as an adult, where you can get really good at it and you can have a sense of control over your work, and that can lead to its own sense of purpose, which is actually a bit divorced from what we classically call passions or interests. And I'd like to put out a disclaimer right now that this is not a path that I have chosen myself. I have wanted to make my interests overlap with my work, and that has given me purpose. But there's a good book out there which makes the counter argument, which is called So Good That They Can't Ignore You, by Cal Newport. And he says, hey, college students, stop trying to follow your passions. Instead, do something that feels like you can really contribute. You'll find a sense of purpose there. You'll get really good at it. You'll rise up within organizations, and then you will feel passionate about it afterwards. Now, I'm so skeptical about that, because I think that can just easily be twisted into saying, like, don't do what you love, just go do whatever the market values the most. It's like, oh, you like ballet? Great, go become a programmer and get really good at it, and then you'll feel the passion for programming. I'm like, oh, I don't know about that. And so it's a tricky thing. I think it's worth evaluating that question from both sides, because it's not always clear that following your passions leads to a sense of purpose. For me, it did. For lots of unschoolers, it did. But I also know unschoolers who have been encouraged to follow their passions for their whole life. And they tell me at age 14 or 17, I don't know what I'm passionate about. And so for a kid like that, maybe reframe the discussion and say, what would make your life feel purposeful? Or what would give you a sense of control?
And all of these questions that are for teens are important for parents to consider, so they can facilitate conversations with their teens and have thought about all the different perspectives that go into it.
I agree.
And that being said, do you want to talk a little bit about the nurture assumption that you write about in your book?
Oh, yes. This is destined to be the least popular chapter of my book. I am so confident about this. Yeah, that chapter is titled, You Have Less Control Than You Think. And I have to be careful here, because as a non-parent writing about parenting, that's very sketchy territory. And so I say in the beginning, listen, kind of like John Holt, I never had kids myself, but I've worked with a lot of other people's kids, and especially a lot of other people's teenagers. And so I'm trying to offer a perspective that's sort of crowdsourced from lots and lots of different kids. So I dive into the parenting literature, and there's this really interesting thing that sociologists have been talking about for about 10 or 20 years now, called intensive parenting. And this is just the new normal, at least in North America, in Europe, in most other highly developed countries. We just think that there is one way to parent, and that is this like very hands-on kind of get your kid to work towards these very tangible goals, usually college. And if your kid is not performing, you need to manage them or micromanage them in the way, it's almost like your kid is your employee and you are their boss or their manager. And so you have a lot of control over them, and you exert a lot of control over them. And this is something that all classes of parents seem to believe right now. And I think that this is an approach to considering the parent-child relationship, which it makes choosing alternative education very difficult. Because fundamentally, if you're choosing to do anything that's unconventional, and you can homeschool, of course, in a very conventional way, but you can homeschool or unschool in a much less conventional way. You can send your kid to an alternative school, which is still quite conventional, like a Waldorf school, or you can send your kid to a highly unconventional school. And the thread here of the unconventional stuff is you are letting go of control over the process of how your kid grows up, of what goals they're working toward, and how they're going to get there. And that is a damn scary thing to do. It makes you no longer the boss or manager of your kid, but instead it turns you into more of a consultant, which is an analogy that I love. I took it from the book, The Self-Driven Child, which is a great one especially for parents just getting into alternative education to read. So yeah, a business consultant has a lot of experience, just like you as a parent have a lot of experience, and she will offer advice and guidance to her clients. But if the clients choose to take her advice or not, if the client's business succeeds or fails, the business consultant is fundamentally kind of detached from that whole result, because it's not her business. In the same way that her kid's life is not her life. I didn't talk about the nurture assumption at all, Lainey. I talked about everything else in that chapter.
Well, as I was reading it, I felt a little triggering, but I also liked the research. Like
Yeah.
it was cited so well, and it gave me a lot to think about. And I also think that don't sell yourself short. This is something that parents really need to get a grasp of from all of these different perspectives. And I think it's a powerfully written chapter. So thank you.
I appreciate that.
So I've got really two more questions. The, I'm sure we could speak for hours upon end about the preparation for college, right? To how to translate these experiences out of the formal school setting during adolescence into something that looks like a high school transcript. But it's not just the transcript. Can you talk a little bit about what needs to be done in order to prepare a teen for college, and whether or not, I mean, we can even talk about whether or not that's even a road that we should even think about.
Yeah, well, as you know, that's chapter 5, the looking really deeply into the question of, is it worth it to encourage your kids to go to college? If so, why? And so there's a lot of discussion there, but I'd like to first kind of give my international disclaimer for this, because honestly, it's hard in countries outside of the US and Canada to transition from a highly unconventional background into college. And for a lot of kids, for example, in the UK, a lot of kids there are happily able to homeschool for most of their lives. And then they really do need to go back to high school for at least a few years in order to get the GCSEs. And this is true for a lot of other countries too. What we've done really well in North America is created, not on purpose, but a very flexible system for proving that you have done something which is equivalent to high school. And so that could be something like the GED or a high school equivalency exam. Community college is just this magical institution that I have learned, is so unique, and that it doesn't exist in lots of other places. And so being able to go to a 2-year college, I think in Australia and New Zealand, this is a possibility, but in Europe, it's still a pretty foreign concept. And so that is the tool that most of the self-directed learners who I've worked with have leaned on the hardest in order to make the transition from an unconventional upbringing into 4-year college easy. And a lot of them will just take part-time community college classes starting at age 14, 15, 16. Sometimes they'll transition into full-time, they'll get their 2-year associate's degree, and then no one even looks at their high school background anymore. They just transfer into a 4-year college. And others who are applying as first-year students, they will take a few community college classes and put that into their portfolio to say, hey, this is me. I can handle college level work. You don't have to worry about my very unconventional upbringing.
And can you actually touch a little deeper on whether or not college is a viable option?
Yes, I can. Gosh, where do you even start here? There's this assumption that if you go to college and you get a bachelor's degree, you will earn a lot more money in your life. Now, to a first order approximation, that seems to be true. But first order approximations are not good things to gamble all of your time and money on, because there's a lot of nuance that goes into it. And so I cite a book that came out in 2018 called The Case Against Education, which was written by a very detail-oriented economist, and says, hey, this is who college is a good economic deal for, and this is who it's not a good economic deal for. And it's kind of shocking. It's not a very optimistic picture that he paints. So if you have a kid, if you have a teenager who has shown real interest and aptitude for academics, is saying, I definitely want to do something that requires a college degree, especially something that's like a STEM type major, and they're able to pass those SAT courses without trying too hard, then yes, like I'm not going to make an argument that that kid shouldn't go to college. Maybe they're going into college with some questionable assumptions. Maybe they're being carried by this tide of you know, peer pressure and culture, and that's stuff that as a parent you can help your kid think critically about. But yeah, for some kids it's definitely going to pay off. Just speaking in terms of money, but for a lot of other kids, college can be actually a negative economic investment. And so if you have a kid who seems not that interested in college, is just going because they want to please their parents or someone else, or they have friends that are going, and it's very likely that they are going to drop out before they finish a degree. And if they're taking on student debt, that is like sirens are going off here. Stop, wait, like you don't have to force your kid to go to college at age 18. Let them take their time. Let them feel an intrinsic draw towards college. You know, it should be a straightforward proposition for them. If they're really hemming and hawing about it, I'd say you should be careful, especially if they're going to a college that costs a bunch of money, which is pretty much every college in the United States. If we're in, see, that's why this education scene is so weird and interesting, Lainey, because in Europe, where alternative education and homeschooling is much more difficult to do in K through 12, they often have publicly funded university systems. And so you can, it's much less of a economic risk and a gamble to go do four-year university if you're in Europe. So you really, here's what we should do. You should unschool in North America or from one of the other countries that lets that happen, and then go to college in Europe where you spend almost no money. That's a winning combination right there.
Perfect. You know, I've often heard the argument that, you know, especially for the kids that aren't sure what they want to focus their life on, you know, go to college, you'll discover lots of different things and just focus in general studies or liberal arts. And to me, that is the most mind-blowing, incorrect suggestion that you can give to a kid. So why do you think, so this is really my last question, why do you think parents should not worry about removing their kids from a formal education system? Why should they not worry?
All right, first, the research-based answer. It seems most likely that if you choose to homeschool or unschool your kid, if you choose to send them to an alternative school, that they're going to turn out in terms of long-term life outcomes like, you know, college, career, health, they're going to turn out pretty much the same way that they would have turned out if they went to school. And that's sort of an unsexy and actually kind of an unsettling discovery from the research that I found. But it can also be a very relieving one, because it's essentially saying, listen, if you do conventional school or you do unconventional school or homeschooling, it's not going to make a huge difference in terms of the big stuff. And so you can stop worrying about it. And what you should worry about is the thing that you can control, which is your relationship with your kid. And in the final chapter I write about connection, I'm saying, listen, and this also comes with the parenting chapter too, what you have as your long-term asset with your kid is how well you two get along together, whether your kid enjoys who you are and wants to continue being your friend as they go through life. And that is something that you can put a lot of energy into and get a lot of positive results. And to a large part, that means not forcing your kid to do stuff that they really don't want to do. In the same way that if you forced your spouse to do something they really didn't want to do, they would resent you. If you forced your friends to do something that they really hated, they would resent you and probably stop talking to you at some point. And so it's just saying kids are people. You know, they are just like anyone else. And very soon, you know, they might be young now, but they're going to have adult level capacities very, very soon. And they're going to remember how they were treated. You know, human beings are extremely good at identifying relationships and assessing how other people treat them. And so this is really just a call for a more humane approach to education, a more loving approach to kids, and to not assuming that we have to force them and browbeat them into hitting all of these very arbitrary milestones that the education system has given us that were really only created within the last 100 years. No, No, stop it. Just have a great relationship with your kid, see where their engagement and their interest, takes them, and, follow the kid. Be a consultant instead of a boss. I think if you do all that, you don't have much to worry about because you're going to have a great relationship with your kid. They'll tell you what they need, and then you can work together to fulfill those needs.
I have to apologize to you. There's a question in the middle of my list of questions, and since I jumped around so much, I didn't ask you about connection because you address connection in your book a lot. So is it okay if I sneak this question in one more time?
Oh,
And I'm
Lainey,
glad you
all
touched on it right
right. Go for it.
now. I'm sorry?
Go for it.
Just I just basically at this point, if you could touch on the value of connection, like the relationship that parents have with their teens as an important element to their development. I mean, you touched on it now, and we don't have much time to go much deeper, but why is connection such an important part of their education?
Well, first of all, we have to figure out what that word even means because a lot of people use it and it can mean different things to different people. I was introduced to this word in the Not Back to School camp community. And in this world, everyone, the staff and the teens were saying, hey, we want to connect. And I was like, I came from a more conventional upbringing and I thought, what do you mean by that? And it took me a while to figure it out. And it took me a lot of time working at Not Back to School camp to see that what connection is it's very multifaceted. There is connection to other people. There's connection to the natural world. There's connection to work and a sense of self. And in the book, I lean on this other book called Lost Connections by Johann Hari, which is a wonderful book. It's about anxiety and depression, actually. And I think that this all connects back to mental health. And there is a mental health crisis, that has already developed among especially adolescents, especially adolescent women also in the US, Europe, most other big countries. And Johann says this mental health crisis can be pretty directly traced to a lack of meaningful connections in people's lives. And maybe meaning is another good word to bring in here, because when a kid spends their time in some sort of conventional school system or some highly conventional homeschooling setup, there's often a lack of meaning. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing. The sense of purpose and relevance is gone. And their interactions with other people are very artificial. The interactions with teachers are artificial. The interactions with other students are artificial. And as a parent, if you have to play the role of the homework police, if you have to play the role of the manager of your kid's education, then you are going to be having a fairly artificial role too. And so it's about abandoning artifice and having more genuine, real interpersonal connections with people, and also connecting kids to meaningful work, connecting them to nature. It's not just about interpersonal relationships. Yeah, it's a big topic, and that's the best I can do, Lainey.
Well, I'm going to recommend that people buy your book and read it.
Well, good. Yeah, because that's where we really go
That's
into
great.
it. Yeah.
So what would you like to leave with our audience, our World Schooling community, about your book, and maybe share where people can find your book?
Sure. I'll say it one more time that if you're already world schooling, this book will probably reassure you, especially if you have kids who are getting a bit older. And there also might be some stuff that feels like, okay, I've heard this before, but world schooling will only get better if we have more people doing it, just like homeschooling, unschooling, alternative schooling. And so I encourage you to use this book as a recruitment tool to bring in other people, and especially to convince the non-believers, the skeptical spouses, the recalcitrant grandparents, anyone who is bringing, your world schooling project down a few notches. I want you to give them this book because that's who I wrote it for. And that's my final message.
And where can people find it?
They can find it on Amazon, on other online bookstores. I'm really encouraging people to order it through their local bookstores right now because it costs the same price on Amazon. You might even get it faster, and local bookstores are really struggling at this moment. And if you ever want to find out more background about the book or about my projects, then go to blakeboles.com, BOLES.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Lainey.